Hi, my name is Sarah Morand. My pen name is S.G. Morand, and I have embarked on a journey to read through all 51 volumes of the Harvard Classics collection. Right now I'm on volume 4, which is all about Milton. In my last few videos, I talked about first Milton's prose that was found in volume 3, and then Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, along with some of Milton's other lesser-known poems that are included in volume 4. And now I'm on to what has turned out to be my favorite Milton that I've read out of all of it, which is Samson Agonistes. And apologies in advance if I'm mispronouncing that. But Samson Agonistes I had never even heard of before picking up the Harvard Classics collection. I had no idea what it was. I guess I kind of assumed when I first saw it that it was about Samson because of the title, but I had no idea what I was getting into starting it, and I had no idea what a pleasure it would be to read. It truly has been one of my favorite things that I've read in the Harvard Classics collection, period, and also specifically with Milton. I really liked Milton's prose, and as his fiction type stuff goes, Samson Agonistes has definitely been my favorite. The last few videos I talked a lot about who Milton was, his story, things like that, gave a little background to who he was. So I'm gonna kind of skip over that in this video because I've covered it repeatedly over the last few videos. So if you're interested in learning more about Milton, check out one of my other videos. I believe I covered him the most thoroughly in my Paradise Lost video. So if you want to learn more about Milton, definitely check that out. But I want to just get straight into Samson Agonistes because I really love this short little story. It's only about, it's less than 100 pages. I believe it's only like 50 or so pages. It's very short, but it includes a lot in it. So obviously it's about Samson from the Bible. It picks up his story after he is taken prisoner after Delilah betrays him and he's taken in by the Philistines and put into prison. And he's sitting in his prison cell before he goes and stands before the people and ends up tearing the temple walls down on him and on all of them, this multitude that was gathered to see him perform, to impress them with his talent. And so he's sitting in this prison cell kind of before that happens. And as he's sitting here, he gets this like moment's respite, and he has these visitors come and visit him, people from his life, and this group that's kind of like the chorus of the story. Milton uses this quite often, this choral type element that appears in like Shakespeare, where you have these interludes where the chorus kind of explains what's going on in the story, what you should expect. At the beginning of the story invokes the muse, things like that. And that definitely is present in Samson Agonistes, and probably more prominently so than in Milton's other works, because this core element is very important to kind of push each act of the story forward. Even though it's a short story, it has sections that are kind of broken apart because Samson receives these different visitors, and each of those different visitors kind of explores a different unique area. So, for example, his father comes and visits him, and Delilah comes and visits him. And so he gets these different aspects of his life, his past, his future uncertainties explored throughout that. The other thing interesting about Samson Agonistes is it was written 1667 to 1671. So it took Milton several years to write this. And that date puts it after Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. So it's kind of towards the end of his career. I think some of his poems that were included at the beginning, his shorter poems, I believe some of those took place after. Well, maybe not. I guess all of the shorter poems were before that as well. So Samson Agonistes is the latest chronologically among Milton's poems and prose that are included in the Harvard Classics collection. So that kind of puts it at the end of his career. It also puts it towards the end of his life because he died in 1974 and this poem concludes in 1971. So it's very near the end for him, and it's interesting, especially for Milton writing something like this, because Samson is blind, and he was blinded by his captors, the Philistines. And so Milton himself being blind, this must have been a very poignant thing for him to write, and something that he could instill some of his personal suffering, personal experiences into this character of Samson as displayed in this story. And it really kind of makes sense that this would be somewhat where Milton concludes his writing, is with Samson Agonistes, which talks about a blind man at the end of his life. And it's a very emotionally charged story and a very good read, and something that I think probably was very emotional and impactful for Milton himself to write. And so Samson Agonistes, it starts with the argument, which is what Milton starts all of his longer poems with. Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, each chapter of those has an argument. And Samson Agonistes doesn't have chapter breaks as much as the other ones did. Instead, Samson Agonistes is laid out as one continual long poem, which I believe makes more sense given the short nature of it and just the setup and story points that are hit along this poem. And so instead of an argument before each chapter, Samson Agonistes begins with just a singular argument about what the story is about, why it's important, what will take place during the events of the poem. And again, this is a very helpful tool because sometimes Milton can be a little difficult to read. And by having this tool at the beginning, it allows the reader to kind of know what they're getting into and to see what is happening even when the poem is difficult to follow. And those less complicated words, and it's more straightforward. And so it's a very useful tool, and one that I've very much enjoyed having as I'm reading through Milton, because Milton can be very difficult to read at times. The poem begins on this festival day, and it's this pagan festival, and Samson, sitting in this prison cell, is about to be led out to perform for the Philistines, and he doesn't want to do that because of his religion. He doesn't want to engage in their pagan festival, but he doesn't really have a choice because he's a prisoner. And so he's debating this, and in the meantime, he's getting this little brief respite before all of this takes place, and he's having these visitors come to him at the end. And as the events of the poem progress, you slowly see him start to realize what he needs to do, which is to destroy the temple and all those within it. And it's just a complete tragedy in the realm of a Shakespearean tragedy. It follows a lot of the same type of story beats, and especially the fact that it's all the more tragic because deliverance is just within sight. Samson's about to be able to, his father is looking for a way to get him released, and his father finally thinks he has a way to get him taken out of this prison and restored to a life of freedom. And as this goal is so close within reach, Samson makes the decision to pull down the walls, the columns of the temple onto himself and all of those who are with him. And so he ends up dying this tragic death. But the story of Samson really comes full circle throughout it, is that his last act was an act to bring down this pagan temple, whereas before he was himself distracted and subjected to these type of things, especially by being with Delilah, and he falls short so many times within his life, and he finally at the end of his life gets this kind of redeeming event that he is able to take part in. So there's a short introduction to Samson Agonistes that Milton writes, and he's talking about tragedy as kind of an art form and describing certain things about tragedy, what makes a tragedy, talking about Shakespearean tragedy, things like that. And so the one quote that I pulled from that I thought kind of summed up the introduction really well is, tragedy, as it was anciently composed, hath been ever held the gravest, moralist, and most profitable of all other poems. And I would agree with this, because every time I read poems, stories, especially ancient ones, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, things like that, the tragic elements of it really stick with you. And with Shakespeare as well, I can describe every plot of every Shakespearean tragedy I've read. The comedies, on the other hand, kind of blend together and don't stick with me as well as a lot of the tragedies do. There's no emotional feeling equivalent to reading Midsummer Night's Dream as there is to reading Hamlet. And there's just something about seeing these characters and their lives unraveling and their stories progressing that really sticks with somebody and is much more poignant than comedy or romance. And so it's just something that I think Milton has a point here, is there's something about tragedy that really impacts the reader and sticks with you and gets a story across so much better than any other form of poetry or writing can. And so he's kind of displaying that through Samson Agonistes, because even with Paradise Lost is a tragedy, but there's hope at the end. At the end, you get this hint that the Son of Man will come and deliver mankind from the evil that Satan has brought into the world and will restore us after the fall. And then you get Paradise Regained, which obviously is the conclusion of that and brings even more hope into the realm and the sphere. And then you end up with a story that, when it comes full circle, it really does have this aspect of hope in it, and it feels less tragic. And although it still is very tragic, especially Paradise Lost, you still have this circle, it still comes full circle and gets to this point of hope. And so with Samson Agonistes, Milton is really painting a true tragedy in the classical sense of the word that ends in death and that ends with kind of this deep, dark place that Samson has reached. And he gets so close to the end, and he, in a way, fails. And so it's very much like a traditional tragedy. And so Milton does this introduction to Samson Agonistes that's talking about what tragedy is and why it's important, especially for writers to explore. And now I'm going to read a few quotes that I pulled from Samson Agonistes. Again, this was my favorite of the Milton that I've read, and some of these quotes really stuck with me. But the story itself, there's not much that quotes can properly convey for this story. You really have to read it in its entirety, and it is nice to be able to read it. I think I read it in 2 sittings because I got distracted by something and I had to leave. I would have loved it to be able to read it in 1 sitting, because I think that's really the way it's intended to be read, is in one continuous reading experience. But although I don't think the quotes themselves, pulled out of the context of the whole story, do it justice, I did pull a few to demonstrate why this is such an amazing book. The first quote is, "But what is strength without a double share of wisdom? Vast, unwieldy, burdensome, proudly secure, yet liable to fall by weakest subtleties, not made to rule, but to subserve where wisdom bears command." This really demonstrates Samson's whole life and character arc so well, is that he had all the strength, but he didn't have the wisdom to match it. And with more strength requires more wisdom. And without that wisdom, that strength can falter and fall by the slightest corruption from outside sources. So look at Delilah. It's kind of a little infuriating, actually, to read the biblical story of Samson, because Delilah is so obvious in what she's trying to do. She's so clearly trying to deceive him, and yet he still falls for it. And part of that, I think, is he doesn't think that he can be defeated by her, and he's proud and sees his strength and doesn't think that there's anything she can do to hurt him, and that there's no way that he'll lose his strength. And part of it, I think, is also that he's a little blinded by the lens of this love that he has for her, even though it's falsely placed. And unfortunately, that's largely the case in these tragedies, and something that the story of Samson conveys so well into a tragedy is that there's often these instances where the hero of the story is faced with this temptress who he has to try to outmaneuver, and a lot of the time he kind of fails to do that. And that's the case a lot of the time in the Odyssey. That topic comes up repeatedly throughout the Odyssey in particular, but in other stories as well. And so this idea that wisdom, that strength will be subservient to wisdom is something that is very prevalent in Samson's life, and something that's very important to remember is that wisdom is very important, especially when strength goes along with it. You need more wisdom to handle more strength. The next quote I have is, "This one prayer yet remains. Might I be heard, no longer petition speedy death, the close of all my miseries and the balm." So at the end of Samson's life, he's just saying that he has no more prayers except that speedy death will come, and that it will ease and close all of his miseries and be the balm to the pain and suffering he has endured. And so he reaches this point of absolute despair, where he realizes that death is the only solution to this situation he's gone into, and all he can do is pray for a speedy death. And it's very essential, I think, for him to reach this point where he realizes that there's nothing more that he can do, and short of a miracle, he's not going to get out of this situation that his own actions have led him into. And it's just a very essential moment for his development as a character throughout this poem. Next quote I have is, "If weakness may excuse, what murderer, what traitor, parricide, incestuous, sacrilegious, but may plead it? All wickedness is weakness. That plea, therefore, with God a man will gain thee no remission." So this, I believe this was Samson talking to Delilah. And she was making this excuse that her weakness led her into her actions. Her weakness as a woman, her weakness as a Philistine woman who's married to Samson. And that weakness within her led her to betray him because she was afraid of her own people turning against her. And Samson is saying that weakness has no excuse. And that if weakness is an excuse, then any criminal would use that as an excuse for their actions. And that weakness is no plea before God. And that she will face the consequences for her actions despite the weakness that she proclaims to have led her into those actions. The next quote I have is, "Boast not of what thou wouldest have done, but do what then thou wouldest. Thou seest it in thy hand." And if I'm remembering correctly, this is this might be the chorus talking to Samson, or it's Samson thinking to himself. And it's that you can't think about what you had done in the past. You can only think about what you can do going forward. And so he's thinking about, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. And you can't have that kind of mindset. You have to think of what you can do going forward, what is within your reach, what you can do in your current situation. The next quote I have is, "I know no spells, use no forbidden arts. My trust is in the living God, who gave me at my nativity this strength, diffused no less through all my sinews, joints, and bones than thine, while I preserved these locks unshorn, the pledge of my unviolated vow." And this is Samson explaining his power, explaining that it's not from magic or some forbidden arts, but it's a gift from God, and God is whom he puts his strength in and his trust in. And this power was given to him at his birth, and he was able to use it as long as he kept his Nazarite vow, and had his hair uncut and didn't drink of the grape of the vine and did not eat meat that was unclean and things like that, and did not touch death and things like that were part of the Nazarite vow. And he broke all of those things throughout his life. But the last straw was having his hair cut by Delilah and having his vow completely broken. And that's what made him lose his abilities. Next quote I have is, "But patience is more oft the exercise of saints, the trial of their fortitude, making them each his own deliverer and victor over all that tyranny or fortune can inflict." So, again, something that Samson had to learn throughout his life is that patience is a virtue, and it's very important. And the patience in trials and patience throughout everything that happens in your life is crucial. And Samson is learning that patience can pull you through trials and give you fortitude, and in a way save you, make you your own savior from that situation. Patience gives you peace to endure whatever comes, and it can make you victor in a way over tyranny and whatever happens in your life. It gives you the mindset to persevere through those things and to be able to overcome them, even if you're not able to escape those circumstances. The next quote I have is, "If I obey them, I do it freely, venturing to displease God for the fear of man, and man prefer set God behind, which is his jealousy, shall never unrepented find forgiveness." So Samson is saying that if he follows these Philistines who are ordering him to go and perform before them at their festival, he would be doing so of his free will. Even though he's a prisoner, he can still make that choice internally whether he's going to obey them and follow their orders or not. And so he's saying that if he does, if he does go, it's not because he's compelled to go. He makes the choice to go freely. And if he does that, he's betraying God because of the fear of man. He's not fearing what God might be able to do to him, but he's fearing what man might do to him. And that is something that in a way is unforgivable, because God is a jealous God, and he wants your dedication and your fear and your reverence, and that you should focus that on him and not on mankind. And so Samson is considering this as they are ordering him to go and to perform at their pagan festival. But Samson finds this loophole of his where he's like, okay, I'm gonna go, and I'm gonna go willingly, but I'm going to destroy all of them, and even at the cost of my own life. And the last quote I have is, "Hopeful of his delivery, which now proves abortive as the firstborn bloom of spring nipped with the lagging rear of winter's frost." And this was towards the end of the story. And this is talking about how the deliverance that Samson was so close to getting, so close to being able to escape from these circumstances, proved as weak and hopeless as the first blooms of spring arising and then being destroyed by winter frost. And it's just such a poetic line to kind of end on. And I believe that was the last line in the entire story, and it just really stuck with me. Is really the essence of the tragedy of Samson. Is that he came so close, but he fell so far. And there was just something about this story that really resonated with me, and it was just a very enjoyable story to read. And sometimes I feel like that's kind of, you can learn something from stories, and you can learn something from tragedies, very much so. But sometimes they're just a joy to read, even despite the direness of their subject matter. And that was how Samson Agonistes was. I really loved this story. I'm so happy it's how Milton ended and how Volume 4 ended, because it really, I I had a lot of issues reading Milton. It was a very difficult, his works were very difficult for me to read. Just the difficulty of the writing to understand, and I tend to have issues sometimes with the kind of epic poems, getting the cadence in my mind so that I can understand when the sentences end and new ones begin and things like that. I struggled a lot when I read Beowulf for the first time, way more than this, but I do think Beowulf, if I'm remembering correctly, is included later on in the Harvard Classics, so I'll have to read that again. I'll probably, all of the ones that I've already read, I probably will go ahead and read again as I get to them in the Harvard Classics collection. But definitely not looking forward to Beowulf as much. I love the story, but it's definitely a hard read. Milton was definitely a hard read at times. And I'm very glad that I was able to end on a high note with Samson Agonistes. Really enjoyed this book. Looking forward to reading the next books in the Harvard Classics series now that I'm done with Volume 4. Yay! I'm on to Volume 5. But it's going to be interesting with Emerson. Emerson is Volume 5, and it's one book with a bunch of essays in it. So we'll see how it goes. I may get slowed down a little bit and have to talk about some other stuff besides just the Harvard Classics collection. So I looking forward to the next video. If you like videos like this, please like and subscribe. If you have a comment about if you've read Samson Agonistes, please add that down below. And I'll see you in the next video.